Tonight's lecture is over water pollution. Back in 1974, when he had just begun his career at Louisiana State University, biologist Eugene Turner took a 15-foot skiff out along the Gulf Coast to survey the water. He brought a handheld oxygen meter along with him. Other researchers had measured oxygen levels in the same waters and had come up with some disturbingly low numbers. Levels low enough to essentially, quote-unquote, suffocate any aquatic organism that couldn't relocate to more oxygen-rich waters. But none of them had followed up, and Turner was curious. Were those earlier measurements wrong? Were they flukes? Sure enough, Turner's own readings came up low as well, much lower than expected. His curiosity deepened. What would cause low oxygen levels in these waters? He suspected the myriad of oil rigs in the nearby waters might have something to do with it, but due to the complicated nature of water pollution, he also knew that the true culprit could be hiding hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Thus began a study of what would become known as the Gulf of Mexico Dead Zone by Turner and his colleague Nancy Rebellius that is still going strong more than 4 decades later. Month after month, year after year, in bigger and better equipped boats, Turner and Rebellius have surveyed the water, mapping out a hypoxic zone that grew from 15 square miles in 1988 to a peak, so far, of 8,776 square miles in 2017. That's about the size of New Hampshire. As they quickly learned, oil and gas rigs were not the main problem. And that brings us to key concept number 1. Water pollution may come from readily identifiable sources such as discharge pipes, point sources, or from more dispersed sources such as stormwater runoff or atmospheric fallout, non-point sources. So water pollution is the addition of any substance to a body of water that might degrade its quality. The list of such substances, or pollutants, is depressingly long. Raw sewage and industrial chemicals like petrochemicals get dumped directly into bodies of water. Meanwhile, contaminants like mercury and acid-forming precursors, along with other air pollutants from fossil fuel combustion or industry, fall back to Earth with rain and flow as stormwater runoff into rivers, streams, lakes, and seas. Nutrients from fertilizers and animal wastes and pesticides also enter from farm and lawn runoff. Sediments from soil erosion can flow into surface waters from farms, construction sites, or heavily eroded stream banks that are no longer shored up by well-rooted plant communities. Water pollution is not limited to the introduction of chemicals or sediment. Municipal trash often finds its way into rivers, streams, and oceans as well. Furthermore, the heated water released into surface waters near power plants causes thermal pollution, thereby raising the temperature of the water enough to impact many of the organisms that live in that stretch of river, lake, or ocean. Even groundwater sources can become polluted from underground chemical storage tanks or from the movement of surface pollutants down through the soil. So there are 2 classes of pollution defined by how they are delivered to the water. Point source pollution is water pollution whose discharge source can be clearly identified. That is, one can point to the source. This includes pollution from large discharge pipes of wastewater treatment plants or industrial sites. The discharge itself is known as effluent. Some of the effluent has the capacity to be quite dangerous. In most cities, sewer pipes run alongside streams because engineers assume that piped sewage will flow in the same direction and therefore reach treatment plants via gravity. But in many urban areas, those pipes are old and beginning to leak. With such a leak, raw sewage flows directly into the stream. Contamination is particularly bad in cities of the developing world where raw sewage is often directly released untreated into bodies of water. In many such places, waterborne pathogens, that is, disease-causing organisms, in raw or partially treated human and animal waste represent a leading cause of sickness and death. But the good news is that because point sources can be easily identified, they can also, at least hypothetically, be remedied. So as researchers would soon discover, the low oxygen levels in the Gulf of Mexico were due to a different and even more challenging problem, a non-point source of pollution. The origins of non-point source pollutants are not easily identifiable. Though some arrive by air, most enter the water from overland flow, that is stormwater runoff. This means they can come from any part of the land that drains into a given body of water. Heavy rains that produce large amounts of runoff or even flood conditions can also release toxins trapped in soil, reintroducing these into the water or the air. Non-point source pollutants can include everything from human-made toxic substances to natural substances such as silt, sand, and clay, which can enter the water as sediment pollution, that is eroded soil that is washed into the water through runoff. To be sure, these substances deliver valuable nutrients to aquatic ecosystems, but excessive amounts of them can cloud the water, making it hard for sunlight to penetrate and thus disrupting photosynthesis. Sediment pollution can also harm organisms directly by clogging gills. And when it covers the sea or river bottom, sediment can smother the nooks and crannies that serve as habitat or spawning areas. And that brings us to infographic number 1. Water pollution comes from a variety of point and non-point sources. Although the main threat to the Gulf of Mexico is excess nutrient and sediment runoff, the EPA identifies pathogens as the leading cause of impaired waters in the United States as a whole. Found in sewage or animal waste, pathogens can become both point and non-point sources. Moving on, various pollutants contribute to many miles of U.S. surface waters that are quote-unquote impaired, that is, waters that are too polluted to meet state or local water quality standards. And that brings us to key concept number 2. The influx of excess nutrients into a body of water may spur algal growth and bacterial population explosions, which may ultimately result in hypoxia that is severe enough to harm aquatic life. So something in the Gulf waters, some pollutant, was causing the levels of dissolved oxygen to plummet. This is a condition known as hypoxia. Turner and Rebalius knew that hypoxia was a serious problem. Water can hold only a limited amount of oxygen, much less than found in air. So even a small decrease can have immediate effects on the aquatic life. Even underwater, organisms need oxygen to survive. Like terrestrial beings, they use it in the process of cellular respiration. Waters so depleted of oxygen that aquatic life suffers are known as dead zones. So it turns out that an excess of 2 nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, were triggering a process known as eutrophication. Here's how eutrophication works. Because nitrogen and phosphorus fuel plant growth, extra amounts trigger explosions of algal growth. Though algae produce oxygen through photosynthesis, they also block sunlight from reaching underwater plants in shallow waters, ultimately blocking much more photosynthesis than they conduct. So oxygen levels start to drop as underwater photosynthesis declines. Unable to perform photosynthesis, the plants at the bottom of the water die en masse. When that happens, the turbidity or cloudiness of the water increases. Dead and dying plant roots can no longer secure the river seabed in the shallow areas, and the bottom sediments can easily enter the water column if distributed by waves or fast-moving water. Decaying matter also contributes to the cloudiness. This increased turbidity reduces photosynthesis and therefore reduces oxygen levels even more. From there, it gets even worse. As plants die, they are consumed by bacterial decomposers, triggering yet another bloom, a bacterial one. The bacterial populations increasing rapidly, consuming oxygen as they digest the dead plants, quickly depleting any remaining oxygen in the water. This high rate of decomposition in the bottom layer is the major cause of hypoxia in deeper water, such as those further offshore in the Gulf of Mexico. oxygen levels can drop low enough to kill invertebrate and vertebrate animals that cannot escape to oxygen-rich waters elsewhere. This scenario plays out in water bodies everywhere. In small ponds, the Great Lakes, and huge expanses of coastal waters, there are more than 500 dead zones worldwide. So hypoxic waters are more than an environmental problem, they are also an economic concern. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimates that the oxygen-poor waters of the Gulf of Mexico cost millions of dollars lost in revenue to the seafood and tourism industries each year. Species like oysters can't escape the oxygen-poor waters and die. Others move away from coastal dead zones, making it harder and more expensive for commercial fisheries to catch them. Nitrogen pollution can also upset the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus in ocean water, which can negatively affect coral, making it harder for them to take up phosphorus, essentially starving the coral. This makes them more susceptible to other stressors such as warmer waters and may contribute to coral bleaching. Another complication comes from the form of algal blooms that are actually toxic. Nutrient pollution may trigger the growth of photosynthetic bacteria or cyanobacteria that produce deadly toxins. These bacteria can grow in fresh or salt water. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency recommends, but does not require, that public water departments test drinking water for these toxins if their presence is suspected and take steps to purify the water or issue a do not drink advisory if levels exceed recommended amounts. Even swimming in or coming into contact with water contaminated with cyanobacterial toxins can sicken individuals. Children and the elderly are the most at risk for serious health problems. In the summer of 2019, the waters along the entire coastline of the Mississippi were closed to swimming due to cyanobacterial outbreaks fueled by extremely heavy spring rains in the Midwest that washed fertilizer and sewage into the Gulf of Mexico. Though most people will avoid exposure simply because they are unwilling to swim or play in water covered with green scum, our pets may not be so picky. A Labrador retriever will readily chase a ball thrown into the water. In the process of retrieving the ball several times or licking itself clean, the dog may consume enough toxin to be killed. Fish can also succumb to this. The sight of dead fish washing ashore after a eutrophoric event is a clear sign of cyanobacterial toxins. But where was all the extra nitrogen and phosphorus coming from in the first place? And that brings us to infographic number 2. Healthy Gulf water is relatively clear with abundant sea life. Oysters and forage fish filter out particles, keeping water clean, while submerged vegetation produces oxygen to support healthy fish and shellfish populations. Moving on, algal blooms, sediments that block sunlight and prevent photosynthesis, or an influx of bacteria that deplete the water's oxygen, can each produce hypoxic regions. And that brings us to key concept number 3. All the land area over which water could potentially flow and empty into a body of water is that water body's watershed. Runoff can pick up pollutants in the watershed and deliver them to the water body. Land uses that decrease runoff and increases infiltration protect surface waters and help to recharge aquifers. So the entire Mississippi River watershed drains into the Gulf of Mexico. The watershed of any river, stream, lake, or coastal body of water is simply the area of land over which rain and other sources of water flow to drain into a given water body. It also includes all the smaller streams, tributaries, that empty into the water body and their watersheds. The watershed of the Colorado River, also known as the Colorado River Basin, spans 7 states and is highly dependent on northern tributaries for most of its water. The watershed feeding the Gulf of Mexico is even bigger. It stretches well past the Louisiana Basin and the Mississippi River Delta, all the way up to the northernmost reaches of the continental United States. Indeed, to glimpse the cause of and possible solutions to the hypoxia uncovered by Turner and Rebellius, we must travel to Minnesota, where the Mississippi River begins. So the flow of nitrogen and other fertilizer components over a watershed is well mapped and shows that runoff pollution can directly affect surface water quality by delivering pollutants. But that's not all. This runoff also impacts groundwater. When it rains, some rainfall soaks into the soil, infiltrating the ground below. Some eventually reaches groundwater in the aquifer, which people can tap into to create a well. If the groundwater is deep enough, infiltration can act as a filtering system that purifies the water. If, however, the water table, that is the upper level of the groundwater, is close to the surface, pollutants can make it to the groundwater. For example, nitrate pollution from fertilizer runoff can contaminate well water enough to be life-threatening, especially to young children. But groundwater quantity can also be affected. Human land uses have altered the way water drains through watersheds and waterways. Pavements and even suburban lawns enhance runoff by preventing water from soaking into the ground, reducing the rate at which aquifers are refilled. They can be rapidly depleted if we remove the well water faster than it is replaced. Meandering streams have been channelized and their water diverted for other uses. Wetlands, too, have been completely drained to allow for urban or suburban development or for agricultural development. These activities reduce the infiltration of rainwater into the ground by speeding the flow of water access and out of a watershed, sending with the water whatever industrial, agricultural, or municipal pollutants it encounters on its trip downhill. In the Mississippi River watershed, this includes runoff pollution from roadways, urban areas, and industries throughout the region, as well as animal waste and excess fertilizer from hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland. In all, some 1.5 million tons of nitrogen and phosphorus now flow through the Mississippi River watershed and into the Gulf of Mexico every year. In 2008, the newly formed Gulf of Mexico Watershed Nutrient Task Force set a goal to reduce the hypoxic zone down to 1,930 square miles. That same year, Rebellius and Turner concluded that the Gulf ecosystem was becoming more sensitive to nutrient loads. And that brings us to infographic number 3. Anything that happens in the watershed can potentially affect the quality of a body of water as well as the quality of the groundwater. This is especially important in terms of non-point source pollution that originates on land. Mapping the watershed is an important tool in the watershed management, and here the watershed of the river and coastal areas is outlined by a black dashed line. And that brings us to key concept number 4. Chemical and physical characteristics of water can be modified to assess water quality. A biological assessment determining the type and number of species living in the water is also used to evaluate water quality. So scientists continually assess the impact of nutrient runoff on the Mississippi River watershed's various ecosystems. Chemical parameters of water quality such as pH and dissolved oxygen content are often monitored to see if these values are within acceptable limits for the organisms who live there. For example, pH needs to be around neutral and it needs to have a high dissolved oxygen content. If a particular pollutant is suspected, such as nitrates from fertilizer pollution that can be checked, physical parameters are then assessed to include the water's turbidity, that is cloudiness, and temperature. A higher temperature means lower dissolved oxygen levels. But not everyone has the equipment or supplies to measure these chemical and physical parameters. For those who do, chemical and physical measurements that are within acceptable limits can sometimes be deceiving. Water may look crystal clear because it supports little life, and undetected chemical might have killed everything in the water. Another way to assess water quality is a process known as biological assessment. This can be as simple as netting, identifying, and counting benthic macroinvertebrates such as insects and crayfish that inhabit the bottom of streams such as the ones that empty into the Mississippi River. If a stream is unhealthy, there won't be many organisms present that are sensitive to the pollutants. The abundance and diversity of pollution-tolerant and pollution-sensitive species in the sample can be used to rate the stream quality. Poor stream quality can sometimes indicate that nutrient runoff or toxic substances are polluting the water, or that sediments are smothering the needed stream bottom habitat. Similar protocols are in place to assess other populations that can serve as indicators of water quality, such as fish or algae. And that brings us to infographic number 4. A simple way to investigate the water quality of a stream is a biological assessment, using a net to collect a sample of aquatic organisms to see what is living in the water. If there is a good diversity and abundant aquatic life, especially those organisms that are sensitive to pollution, then it is reasonable to conclude that the water is clean. A poor sample suggests there is a problem, prompting one to look more closely at water quality to determine the issue. And that brings us to key concept number 5. The Clean Water Act sets pollution standards to limit the release of pollution from point sources and has been effective at reducing this form of pollution. It has been less effective at controlling non-point source water pollution. So water quality has always been a concern, but perhaps never more so than in the late 1960s. At the time, there were no restrictions on the release of industrial chemical pollutants into bodies of water. From the sewage-filled Potomac River flowing through Washington, D.C., and being declared a national disgrace by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965, to Lake Erie's massive algal blooms that made it one of the nation's early dead zones, U.S. environmental waters were in trouble. In 1969, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio made headlines when it caught on fire, and not for the first time, because so much oil and other flammable industrial pollutants floated on the surface of the water. So this dramatic event helped spur the passage of the 1972 Clean Water Act, which regulates industrial and municipal, such as sewage treatment plants, point source pollution. With the goal of making all environmental waters fishable and swimmable, as with all environmental laws, the EPA administers the Clean Water Act by writing guidelines known as rules that comply with the scope and intent of the law. The EPA accomplishes this fishable and swimmable goal by setting performance standards, that is, allowable levels of a pollutant that can be present in environmental waters or released over a certain period of time. For example, the Clean Water Act protects the public against pathogens in recreational waters such as rivers, lakes, and coastal areas. This is a leading cause of impaired waters in the United States and a major problem worldwide. Globally, exposure to pathogen-polluted water is one of the leading causes of infection. Close to 1 million people die each year of diarrheal diseases linked to unsafe water. The United Nations cites the provision of clean water and sanitation as one of its 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. In the United States, the EPA allows only very small amounts of fecal bacteria such as E. coli in recreational waters. The presence of fecal bacteria indicates sewage or animal waste contamination. The Safe Drinking Water Act mandates that absolutely no pathogens are allowed in drinking water. Violations are investigated and addressed at either the federal or state level. Today, about 47% of the United States streams and rivers meet fishable, swimmable goals. Other bodies of water don't fare as well. Only 28% of the assessed coastal waters meet this criterion, and less than 3% of the Great Lakes waters do so. The Clean Water Act, like many environmental protection laws, has a citizen suit provision that allows citizens or groups to sue a violator of the act, or the state or federal government if they feel the statutes of the Clean Water Act are not being upheld. This empowers citizens to work to ensure the protection of the surface waters in their own communities. In the original rules approved by the EPA for the Clean Water Act enforcement, only navigable waters and those of immediate municipal or recreational value were slated for protection. But that left many upstream areas unprotected, making them potential sources of pollution for the downstream waters the Clean Water Act was mandated to protect. And that brings us to infographic number 5. The Clean Water Act is the landmark environmental federal law that established the modern framework for the regulation of water pollution in the U.S. surface waters. Many other nations have copied this framework in drafting their own water protection legislation. And that brings us to key concept number 6. Good watershed management can reduce non-point source pollution. Limits can be set for the maximum amount of a pollutant that can enter the water, and steps can be taken to meet those targets. So the Clean Water Act does not specify how much nitrogen fertilizer a farmer can apply. And this is not feasible because recommended amounts can vary from farm to farm, and runoff potential varies according to rainfall, terrain, and even the crop that is planted. But scientists, farmers, and homeowners are working to fix it. Although they differ in their preferred approaches, most scientists agree that watershed management, that is the management of what goes on in an area around streams and rivers, will be key to saving the Gulf. They've identified the best management practices, that is, agreed upon actions that minimize pollution problems caused by human actions that reduce the amount of pollution being delivered to the Mississippi River. In agriculture, many of these practices focus on ways to decrease the amount of chemicals applied to land areas in the first place and to reduce potential for soil erosion and runoff. Recent Clean Water Act amendments advocate the use of these best management practices and provide funding for their implementation. However, watershed management is not easy to do, after all. Many individuals and groups are engaged in a wide variety of different land uses within any watershed. Identifying how each should address its contribution to non-point source water pollution, much less enforcing compliance, is no small task. One approach that is being used is to set total maximum daily load limits for a specific pollutant or for a pollutant group, for example, nutrient pollution. This is the maximum amount of the pollutant that can enter the water on a daily basis. The state agencies responsible for meeting the goals of the Clean Water Act often set total maximum daily loads. Targets can be adjusted downward to improve water quality over time. For point source pollution, sources of a pollutant, for example, industries, sewage treatment plants, etc., are allotted a portion of that total maximum daily load via permit systems. But administering a total maximum daily load system for non-point source pollution is harder. For example, it is not feasible to assign each farmer or suburban homeowner a portion of the nitrogen-phosphorus total maximum daily limit for their nearby body of water. One approach used to address eutrophication in the Chesapeake Bay has been to establish total maximum daily loads for the bay and then allocate a portion of that to different regions within the watershed, which spans 6 states and the District of Columbia. Actions to help the region meet the reduction targets include banning the use of fertilizer in some areas and applying more stringent standards of waste handling to large animal operations. In addition, farmers and urban planners are assisted financially and with technical guidance in implementing best management practices that reduce runoff. In its midpoint assessment, 7 years after the Chesapeake Bay total maximum daily load plan was implemented, the EPA reported that the area was on track to meet targets for phosphorus total maximum daily loads. It is still short of its target for nitrogen pollution in some areas, but progress has been made. One of the key steps in preventing runoff pollution from reaching a body of water is to restore the natural areas of the watershed's riparian areas, that is, land areas close to the water. This is done by maintaining or planting vegetated buffer zones that slow runoff and give rainwater time to soak into the ground before it reaches a nearby body of water. Healthy, well-vegetated riparian areas are widely recognized as critical to maintaining good water quality, and projects are underway across the United States to restore and revegetate the riparian areas and watersheds of rivers and streams. In the late 1900s, New York City invested billions of dollars to restore and protect areas in the Catskills and the Delaware watershed supplying its water. Thanks to this investment, the city avoided the need to construct high-tech and costly filtration systems. Also, wetlands can be targeted for restoration, such as the multi-billion-dollar restoration project underway to restore some of the natural water flow in the Florida Everglades, a major water source for South Florida. And that brings us to infographic number 6. The area next to a body of water that impacts that water provides shade and nutrients, and itself is impacted, water-tolerant species live here, is the riparian area. A well-vegetated riparian area reduces the runoff that reaches a body of water by slowing the water's movement across the land so that it soaks into the ground rather than flowing into the streams. Moving on, shown here are the U.S. Department of Agriculture's recommendations for land use in the riparian area. This includes setting aside at least 75 feet of land in managed and undisturbed forest. More may be required for suitable protection in areas with steeper terrain, that is, where runoff flow would be faster. And that brings us to key concept number 7. Decreasing non-point source pollution can be accomplished by minimizing the use of chemicals on lawns and farms and by redirecting or capturing stormwater to prevent runoff from reaching bodies of water. So protecting or restoring riparian areas can decrease the amount of runoff from farm fields that reaches nearby waters, but farmers can also take steps to reduce the runoff that leaves their fields in the first place. It is common for farmers to install systems to drain the subsurface water out of wet soils. This allows them to plant earlier in the spring, and it protects crops from heavy rains that might flood the field. Since nitrogen is water-soluble, these drainage pipes, commonly called tile lines, end up being the pollutant's passageway. Scientists argue that in order to address the problem of nutrient runoff, it's going to take a huge shift in federal policies. It will also take a shift in the global food economy and even in our culture. So in that regard, it may be difficult to persuade farmers to stop planting corn and soybeans and to move them off of synthetic fertilizers and move them off of fossil fuels, but what can be done is manage the tile lines, and that can be done farm by farm. Jeffrey Strock, a soil scientist at the University of Minnesota, is investigating ways to do just that. In 2003, he teamed up with Minnesota farmer Brian Hicks to study new methods to reduce runoff and fertilizer contamination of nearby streams and rivers. Hicks's land was perfect for this experiment. It was a snowbound expanse of 1,500 acres that straddles the Cottonwood River, which feeds the Minnesota River, in which turn feeds the Mississippi River. And because Hicks and his father used to run cattle and had yet to convert some of their pasture land to corn and soybean, there was still virgin prairie left. That meant Strock and his team could use untouched land to install and compare 2 different drainage treatments. On the east side of their experimental plot, Strock and Hicks installed a conventional drainage system which buried pipes that drained away excess water from the soil at a steady rate. On the west side, they installed a controlled drainage system that could alter the depth of water via a small wooden box that would serve as a dam to meet the needs of the crop. The hope was that the controlled drainage site would store more water and nutrients in the top layer of soil, which would then be available during crop production. They discovered that during normal rainfall years, there was a 50% reduction in the nutrient loss and a slight increase in yield for the controlled drainage zone compared with conventional drainage zones. Other agricultural best management practices will also reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus available to runoff. One recommendation is to frequently test the soil to ensure that the correct type and amount of fertilizer are added as needed, and to avoid adding fertilizer right before rain to prevent it from washing away. Tilling fertilizer directly into the soil rather than spreading it on the surface also reduces the potential for loss due to runoff or wind. In addition, a variety of erosion prevention methods are available to farmers, such as planting winter crops in the off-season to hold soil in place, or planting trees as windbreaks to reduce soil erosion from wind. Farmers are also going high-tech, pursuing precision agriculture by using GPS technology to guide farm equipment and reduce overlap when working a field, thus reducing disturbance of soil that might lead to erosion, and to guide site-specific applications of chemicals within a single field to minimize the amount used. Of course, not all of hypoxia's solutions will come from the Farm Belt. In suburban areas, lawns can be a major non-point source of nitrogen pollution if homeowners apply too much fertilizer. However, grass also sequesters nitrogen because of its long growing season, preventing it from flowing to the nearest stream. The best practice is probably to limit fertilizer use on lawns and to plant native plants and grasses that do not need fertilizer. Planting a rain garden of tolerant plants in low-lying areas that tend to flood in rain events can also help capture water and reduce runoff. In urban and suburban areas, replacing some hard surfaces with porous surfaces, such as green space or permeable pavers, reduces runoff by allowing water to seep through. For this reason, Chicago has changed a large part of its alley pavement to porous concrete. Garden roofs can also help capture rainwater and slow or prevent its release to the environment. Installing curb cutouts in roadways can direct stormwater flow to soak into the ground rather than flowing directly into the storm drain, which often takes it to nearby water bodies. And that brings us to infographic number 7. Stormwater that doesn't soak into the ground can enter storm drains that flow directly to rivers and streams or can cause floods, especially in heavy buildup urban settings. Anything that increases infiltration can help avoid these stormwater problems. And that brings us to key concept number 8. Addressing water pollution includes identifying where problems exist, reducing pollution at the source, employing watershed management to reduce runoff potential, and restoring wetlands. So water pollution is a wicked problem with many causes and consequences, as well as multiple stakeholders who have often different opinions about what actions to take. But the success of the Clean Water Act in controlling point source water pollution in the United States shows that progress can be made. Likewise, steps to address watershed health and reduce the potential for runoff are reducing non-point source pollution. To address hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf Task Force has identified a multi-pronged holistic approach that considers all the causes and consequences of the problem in a plan that addresses the triple bottom line. The environmental needs of the coastal and offshore ecosystems are addressed by pursuing best management practices that reduce the occurrence or impact of water pollution. For example, steps that restore and conserve riverside or coastal habitats in the Gulf watershed will reduce the amount of pollution that reaches the Gulf and protect the species that live there. This, in turn, will protect the ecosystem services these species provide, such as water purification. Taking steps to reduce pollution at the source, for example, reducing industrial point source and agricultural non-point source water pollution, will make these restoration efforts even more effective. The efforts and others will also address the social impacts on human communities that are affected throughout the Gulf region as important fisheries are replenished and protected. Coastal communities also benefit from improved protection against storm surges or coastal erosion. Finally, the plan accounts for the economic realities that require us to prioritize our actions, first pursuing either those actions that are less expensive and are easy to implement, or those that are more costly with high payoffs to the environment or the community. And in infographic number 8, we can see goals and strategies for the Gulf of Mexico regional ecosystem restoration. And that brings us to our core message for this chapter. Water pollution decreases usable water supplies, it harms wildlife and human life, and is caused by many human actions. The solution is to control what we discharge into the water, restore forested areas, and limit the use of pollutants. So let's summarize this chapter. In 2017, the Gulf hypoxic zone was 8,776 miles squared. Water pollution is a wicked problem with many causes and consequences, as well as multiple stakeholders who often have different opinions about what actions to take. Steps to address watershed health and reduce the potential for runoff are reducing non-point source pollution.